From a psychological perspective, this encounter is fascinating because it begins with a disruption of hierarchy. He is a man conditioned to influence outcomes instantly, through status, pressure, and control. She is a woman conditioned by struggle to protect every inch of ground she earns. When she refuses to surrender that parking spot, she does more than frustrate him. She destabilizes the identity he has built around power, and that is where the danger begins, because what he feels next is not simple attraction, it is fixation born from resistance. At the same time, what draws her in is not merely romance, but the intoxicating experience of being intensely noticed by someone who seems capable of reshaping her entire life. The question is no longer whether they are drawn to each other. The question is whether this connection is healing, or the beginning of mutual ruin.
Tonight, the scene is set in Naples' Rico district, on a street where Adriana fights for a slice of pavement. It is more than mere asphalt to her. It is the one small victory needed to hold the fragments of her day together. She is a woman operating on fumes, her vehicle failing, her body starved of sleep, her spirit worn thin. This small patch of earth transforms into her sanctuary, her final defiant stand against the encroaching darkness. As if summoned by fate, a black Maserati glides into view, a predator of polished steel and unspoken power. The two vehicles pause, modern-day gladiators poised for a duel over this contested ground. The stage is set. From the driver's seat emerges a man who wears his privilege like a second skin. He offers no words, only a flick of the wrist, a gesture of such casual dismissal it is as if he were shooing away an insignificant insect. Her response, however, is not a shout, but the quiet, rhythmic click of her indicator, a simple, elegant act of defiance that declares her presence. This subtle challenge disrupts his silent script, forcing an unwelcome engagement. Every motion he makes is steeped in the unshakable confidence of a man who has never known refusal. His tailored suit and imposing frame are but the outward symbols of an immense, unseen authority. He approaches her vehicle with an air of expectation, as if his will alone should make it vanish. Her car becomes her last bastion, forcing him to breach its walls with a sharp rap against the glass, a clear, percussive warning. The window lowers a fraction. "That is my space," he intones, his voice layered with regal assumption. Her reply is a quiet testament to reason, a simple, irrefutable statement of fact. She was there first. He merely arches a brow, not with irritation, but with a flicker of amusement. Just as she senses a victory, his palm meets the hood of her car, a soft impact that resonates with the weight of ownership. He delivers a soft-spoken ultimatum, a maneuver pulled from a well-worn playbook of psychological control. Her response is a single, stark syllable that lands with the force of a blow. No. In that moment, the world shifts on its axis. This defiance is born not of courage, but of a profound exhaustion and the terror of one more failure. He becomes the avatar for every struggle she has ever faced, and this single moment is her rebellion against it all. She then shifts from defense to offense, attempting to recalibrate the balance of power. The mention of a public garage is a deliberate strike designed to strip away his veneer of exceptionalism. Yet instead of anger, a deep, resonant laugh escapes him. His ego is not wounded. It is intrigued. She has just become a captivating new challenge, a fresh test of his boundless control. He lays down his final card, uttering the family name he believes can bend worlds. Her complete lack of recognition is a stunning blow to his universe, and in that instant, his interest solidifies into obsession. "Carlo Ferretti," he says, the name itself intended as a show of force. The vacant look she offers in return confirms it. She is an unknown quantity, a beautiful, maddening anomaly in his ordered world. He begins to list his holdings, effectively mapping the geography of his influence across her city. And then the name Ferretti connects, igniting the dark, whispered rumors that send a cold dread through her. The whispered history of the Ferretti family fills her thoughts, a dynasty awash in wealth and shadowed by connections to the underworld. And Carlo, the rumors claimed, was the most brilliant and ruthless of them all. But even armed with this chilling information, her resolve does not fracture. He observes her, his objective shifting from simple victory to a deep need to understand her. You are either profoundly brave or a magnificent fool. His gaze sweeps the interior of her car, assembling the pieces of her life and purpose here. He alters his line of attack, questioning if this small victory is worth antagonizing the man who holds her professional fate in his hands. Her retort, that she would debate the point with the Pope himself, transforms his detached interest into a singular fixation. The prize is no longer a patch of asphalt. The prize is her spirit. Your name, he demands, not as a question but as a right he has now earned. It is the craving of a narcissist for a new intoxicating prize. Adriana Romano. He then calmly enumerates the ways he could shatter her professional life, a casual display of his immense power. But Adriana sees the perverse pleasure in his eyes and challenges his threat, rendering it hollow. A slow, appreciative smile touches his lips as he yields the point. The atmosphere between them shifts when she explains that her fire is reserved for those who believe she can be easily broken. He steps away, but immediately reclaims his power with a discreet, purposeful phone call. It is a calculated act to regain the upper hand, casting a shadow of uncertainty over her immediate future. By parking his Maserati in defiance of the law, he demonstrates his utter disdain for the rules that began their conflict. It is handled, he informs her, his words hinting at consequences far beyond a simple ticket. The space is yours, he concedes, but his gaze locks with hers, declaring the start of a new, more intimate conflict. It is your defiance that I find myself wanting. The battle had ended. The war had just begun. He issues a command, not an invitation, for dinner. Her swift refusal is utterly ignored. I am going to learn every single thing about you, he vows, a promise of absolute invasion. That is called stalking, she counters. Due diligence, he corrects, his tone glacially calm. His final masterful move is to predict her eventual consent, born not of fear, but of a mutual curiosity he has skillfully ignited. This 5-minute war sends a current of raw energy through her, a surge of adrenaline she confuses for life itself. He vanishes before she can refuse again, leaving her with a racing heart and unsteady hands. Completely disoriented and now 15 minutes behind schedule, she struggles to regulate her breathing. In the silence, she reaffirms her independence from Carlo Ferretti's influence, aware his words were crafted to undermine her very foundation. Her mind becomes a war zone. As she erects her defenses, another part of her concedes the manipulator was correct. Her own curiosity has become a treacherous liability. The emotion he stirred within her is a potent, slow-acting poison. For months she had existed within a fortress of self-control, a structure Carlo Ferretti had just demolished. She forces the memory down as she steps into a palace for a pivotal client meeting. Securing this client offers 3 months of financial sanctuary. Pushing aside the chaos of their encounter, she enters a state of pure focus, delivering a presentation that is, against all odds, flawless. Her pitch was a triumph. They promise a decision within a week, and a fragile hope takes root. But back in her car, a text from a blocked number illuminates her screen. You arrived 17 minutes late for your appointment. The message continues, reframing her tardiness as a virtue. His omniscient tone makes her feel as if the world itself is unstable. She calls it harassment. He calls it information gathering, a cold, corporate euphemism for obsession. He then speaks of her private financial struggles as if offering a solution. Her demands to be left alone are met with silence. He names a time for dinner on her street, and a circle of ice closes around her heart. The unnerving sense of his omnipresence was already taking root. Her texted refusal is nullified by his two-word response. Yes, you are. He concludes by claiming her, texting only her name, Adriana, as if it were a shared secret. Her hands tremble as she blocks his number, a toxic mix of fury and a perverse thrill stirring old scars. She dismisses the thought of the police. He wages a psychological war, a realm where laws have no jurisdiction. His actions were not illegal, merely a total violation of her soul, and yet some fractured part of her felt acknowledged. This was an echo of a past hurt from a man 18 months prior who had made her feel invisible. Carlo Ferretti, for all his monstrous control, did not see her as insignificant. That singular thought pursues her through the Naples traffic. Her small fourth-floor apartment, her sanctuary, now felt utterly vulnerable. That apartment had been the monument to her self-reliance. That night, she immerses herself in work to banish his memory, but it is futile. Each phone alert is a jolt to her nervous system, keeping her perpetually on edge. Near midnight, a sharp knock at the door turns her blood to ice. A voice announces a delivery. The courier presents a massive bouquet of wildflowers, their rustic charm, a calculated gesture designed to lower her defenses. She protests that the order is a mistake, but the delivery man insists it is paid for. The enclosed card is a mixture of flattery and command. Tomorrow, 8 p.m. Do not make me come for you. Every instinct screamed flight, yet she remained. And so she places the weaponized bouquet in a vase, trying to dissect his strategy. The next day she works, planning to confront him at her door and defy his 8 p.m. deadline. But this defiant plan, this illusion of control, crumbled into dust. At 7:30, she was in the shower. By 7:45, she was mentally selecting an outfit for him. At 7:50, dressed in dark denim and silk, she was ready. She called it a tactical meeting, not a surrender, a necessary lie. At 8 sharp, a rap at the door. She opened it to the full, overwhelming force of Carlo Ferretti's presence. He was dressed down, a deliberately casual look designed to make the Titan seem dangerously attractive. His gaze traveled over her, a slow inventory of every single detail. He pronounced her ready, his stare holding her captive. She made a weak protest while reaching for her purse, a dead giveaway. He merely smirked, savoring her frail show of resistance. He then reframed their conflict as a shared obsession. She refuted it, but his smile was that of a man who knew he had already conquered her every waking thought. He told her to simply stop resisting, confident in her silent capitulation. She yielded without a word, drawn in by a grim curiosity and the palpable danger he radiated. She attempted to set a boundary, one dinner only. He agreed, though his look screamed, "We'll see." His illegally parked Maserati was guarded by a heavy, whom Carlo dismissed with an authoritative nod. As he held her door, she questioned him about the guard. He claimed it was to prevent towing, then shifted to criticizing her neighborhood, a diversion she pointedly ignored. She instantly rose to the defense of her historic neighborhood. He redefined its delinquents as mere pragmatists, then delivered a calculated blow. He had a personal history with this place. Her visible surprise was precisely what he'd orchestrated. He drove the narrow streets with an owner's ease, making it clear he was new money, not from the aristocratic world she might imagine. He sketched out his modest origins. Just as she began to wonder about his journey, he preempted her. "How did I do all this?" he asked, indicating the car, the power, his entire empire. His rise was forged from relentless work, high-stakes gambles, and a comfort with moral ambiguity. He threw out his father's cautious rulebook for moves the old man would have condemned. Some paid off, some nearly ruined him. Each fight built a kingdom his father never dared to imagine. A clear pride colored his voice, yet it was threaded with defensiveness, as if still seeking approval from his deceased father. She inquired about his family. His father, he said, passed 5 years ago. His mother now lived in a Capri villa he'd purchased for her. His mother, he explained, refused to return to the city, haunted by painful memories. The family enterprise was now a cold transaction to protect its assets. He pulled up to Pizzeria da Michele, and a valet materialized from nowhere. Carlo tossed the keys to the man and opened her door. She challenged him for bringing a Maserati to a pizzeria. He retorted that he drove it everywhere. Why feign humility now? Would her worn Fiat make him look better? She defended her car's character. He conceded her Fiat was a wreck with its check engine light aglow, but agreed it had personality, much like her. The question, "What else have you noticed?" escaped her lips. His hand found her lower back, guiding her inside. In a low tone, he replied that he'd noticed everything. Her professional bun, the way she chews her lip while concentrating, the graphite on her hand that marked her as a lefty, that she drank her coffee with milk and 1 sugar. He even knew of the dimple that appeared only with a genuine smile, absent from her corporate facade. She stopped, confronting him. His reply was chillingly serene. He'd had her watched all day. This was the moment meant to make her flee. But instead of terror, she heard herself ask him why. He needed to understand her, he said, the single anomaly in his 33 years of absolute control. He leaned closer, his scent of leather and cedar filling the air. The more he learned, he admitted, the deeper she pulled him in. She whispered that he was a predator, yet she remained perfectly still. He agreed without hesitation, confessing he should have just dismissed her. He held her gaze, obsessed with how she saw him not as a name, but as a man. He spoke of her drive, her spirit, her fight to keep a business alive in Italy's unforgiving market. She demanded his source. He simply stated he knew it all, down to her graduation from the Academy of Fine Arts 6 years prior. He knew of her time at 3 soul-crushing design agencies before striking out alone 2 years ago. He knew the subsequent struggle, her refusal to compromise her art. He knew she was 3 months behind on rent, subsisting on cheap pasta. A wave of hot shame crashed over her. The humiliation felt like a physical impact. He saw it all, every failure, every hard-held principle. Her voice was brittle as she said she was going. As she moved to leave, his fingers closed on her wrist. "Don't," he murmured, adding a whispered, "Please." That one word froze her in place. Carlo Ferretti was not a man who pleaded. His voice was a low vibration, insisting his intent was to show understanding, not to humiliate her. He claimed to have known her exact desperation, from being penniless to hearing creditors at his own door. He spoke of nights without sleep, convinced he was a fool for trying to build an empire from dust. He saw the true woman beneath the professional armor, he said, the one who would not break. Her gaze finally rose to meet his. This absolute force of a man saw her with a terrifying sharpness. She had to know his endgame. "Stubbornness recognizes its own," he answered, claiming they both despised losing. He added that his entire existence was defined by people wanting something from him. He explained that every one of his relationships was a negotiation for wealth, influence, or position. She, he said, was the first who hadn't bowed down during their business war. He immediately dismissed her theory that she was just some experiment. He called her real, a rare commodity in his gilded world. He released her wrist but held his ground. Then he shifted his strategy, adopting a veneer of vulnerability to ask her to dinner. Despite all the warning signs, she found herself believing him. She finally relented. 1 pizza, her treat. "Impossible, Adriana," he interjected smoothly. He contrasted his vast fortune with her overdue rent, ending that discussion. Yet he respected her refusal of his charity. This wasn't charity, he argued, just a dinner invitation. She should let it be. He offered his hand, saying, "Please," a second time. That single word undid her more than any command ever could. She took his hand. The pizzeria was chaos. A long queue stretched out the door, but Carlo strode past it without a glance. The hostess greeted him by name, escorting them to a secluded table in the back. She noted the reserved table. He called it a private arrangement. Their grandfathers, it turned out, had known one another. Some old allegiances, he mused, were worth more than currency. He set aside the menus, ordering in a rapid dialect she couldn't comprehend. He then rattled off their meal: 2 margaritas, a marinara, caprese, and fried zucchini blossoms. He told her to trust him. She retorted that she hardly knew him. He amended his statement: trust his palate, then, honed at this very place since he was 6. He recalled his father bringing the family here each Sunday, their single weekly indulgence. His tone softened with the memory. His father would order a feast, hating to see anything wasted. The children then vied to eat the most. Carlo was nearly always the victor. That didn't surprise her, she said. He corrected her. He wasn't accustomed to winning, but to refusing defeat, a critical difference. He poured the wine. He requested her story, not the cold data his people had gathered. To Carlo, the true story was the person. He wanted the architecture of her ambition, not a simple background file. She met his gaze, hesitated, then began not with her resume, but with her own origin, her grandmother, the seamstress. She described growing up watching her grandmother transform humble cloth into art. That ethos became her own. Design was about perceiving potential, about elevating the ordinary. Carlo latched onto this with intense focus. She agreed, aiming to create works with soul, unlike her past corporate jobs that valued only metrics and fads. Adriana had been caught in a corporate machine, churning out disposable content for clicks and profit. It was a soulless enterprise devoid of art. The wine glass she held felt like a relic from that hollow time. It's why she left to build something meaningful. But idealism doesn't cover expenses, a truth now hitting her with brutal force. He simply nodded, in complete understanding. But she had a fire in her. Her eyes met his as she vowed not to quit, to find a solution as she always had. A faint smile touched Carlo's lips, admiring her fierce resolve. Then came the temptation, an offer to erase her troubles, to flood her with clients. One phone call was all it would take. He asked if she would accept his help. She would not. When he demanded to know why, her voice was glacial. Accepting his help would put her in his debt. And being indebted to a man of his nature, she stated, was a form of suicide. He repeated her words. A man like me. Relishing their meaning. He was the monster mothers warned their daughters about. She countered with a blow. Her mother was dead. He flinched but recovered, suggesting her mother's spirit would be urging her to run from him. He even called her a wise woman whose ghostly counsel she ought to heed. Just then the pizza arrived, its aroma filling the space. He leaned back, studying her. He knew, he said, that she would ignore the warning because her curiosity was a force she could not deny. He even insinuates that some part of her is desperate to know what lies within his world, if only for a moment. Her denial comes swift and sharp. This is just dinner, not an application to join his ranks. But in an act of quiet dominance, he silences her by placing a slice of pizza on her plate. His instructions simple. Eat. Only then, he murmurs, can they establish the rules. And my God, the flavor is so staggering, it shocks her into submission. For a few heartbeats, a strange, fragile peace settles between them as they eat, and the knot of tension inside her slowly unfurls. Then Carlo shatters the brief truce. He demands a single truth from her, a confession she has never offered to another living soul. Her defenses are instantly rebuilt. He calls it a fair exchange. To know who she truly is, he must offer a piece of his own truth in return. She considers telling him to go to hell, but the atmosphere, the low light, the wine, this inexplicable connection, it erodes her defenses. She breaks, revealing her most profound fear, that her whole life is a monumental error. She confesses a terror that consumes her daily, the doubt that she should have remained in the safe harbor of a corporate job, swallowing her pride for a steady wage. She's terrified her ambition is just foolish pride, a force that will lead her to ruin. Carlo simply absorbs her confession, his eyes searching her face as if reading the text of her soul. Then she presses him for his part of the bargain. His truth lands like a quiet devastation. He is utterly and completely alone. He lists his empire's assets, the money, the influence, the respect, an army of men loyal to him, and a line of women waiting for him. He has a family that endures him and any companion he could want for a night. But the brutal truth is this: not one of them truly sees him. He recalls the day before, how she had seen some arrogant man trying to claim a parking space, not a feared head of a criminal dynasty. To the world, he is Carlo Ferretti, the myth. But to her, for one instant, he was nothing more than a man. To hear such vulnerability from the one who commanded her here is a disorienting paradox. Here was a man who had won every battle except the one that truly mattered. His life, she says quietly, must be exhausting. The constant performance of being Carlo Ferretti. He calls it the price of admission to his world, a realm where you are forbidden from being human, permitted only to be an icon. As he pours more wine, he admits that with her, the performance feels entirely futile. He explains that his wealth and power are useless against her. She has already judged him as arrogant, invasive, and a walking personification of danger, and he concedes that her assessment is 100% accurate. But, he notes, it is at least an honest judgment. She calls it the most bizarre dinner she has ever had. He agrees, suggesting that bizarre is infinitely better than dull, a state he has been trapped in for what feels like 10 lifetimes. Then his attention shifts back to her grandmother. He asks if the dressmaker is still alive. Adriana tells him no, that cancer claimed her 4 years ago. The grief ambushes her all over again. She explains that her grandmother was her greatest champion, the one who urged her toward the academy to cultivate her gift. Her parents saw art as a folly and wished for her to be a lawyer. But her Nana never stopped believing. After she was gone, Adriana nearly surrendered, beginning to believe her parents had been right. But she knew that quitting would be a desecration of her grandmother's faith in her. So, in her honor, she continued the fight. As she speaks, Carlo's hand moves across the table to cover hers. The touch should have felt like a trespass, but instead it grounds her like an anchor. They were complete strangers, yet the connection felt solid, tangible. Her grandmother would be proud, he tells her. To struggle and refuse to break, he says, holds more honor than a victory achieved by selling one's soul. She suggests he is speaking from experience. He confirms he has done both, compromised and held his ground, and he knows which path allows a man to find peace in the darkness. His thumb traces slow circles on her hand as he shares a lesson learned through fire. To survive, one must sometimes bend. He defines the line between betraying one's essence and employing strategic intelligence. She immediately challenges him, asking if his illicit business dealings are just his form of strategic pragmatism. He confirms that they are precisely that. The world, he murmurs, is not a simple canvas of black and white. He speaks of the law not as a shield for justice, but as a weapon for the powerful. His own world exists in the gray, the twilight where such rules dissolve into mist. And so he asks her, a chilling question hanging in the air. Does this make him a criminal or simply a man who sees the truth? Her answer is a blade. A judge can decide that. Then she turns it on him. What verdict does he cast upon himself? His expression is an unreadable mask of stone. He answers that he lives by a singular code, his word, rarely given but never broken. He defends what is his. He honors the fragile trust placed in him. The world may call him a monster, he concedes, but his own conscience is a still, clear lake. Her comeback cuts to the bone. Is she then something that now belongs to him? Something he must protect? He replies that the proposition is on the table, then turns the question back on her. Is she going to allow it? He leans forward, the space between them shrinking until his world contains only her. He clarifies that his proposal is not about more staid, formal dinners. He wants to investigate the volatile electricity that crackles between them, whatever it may be. She dismisses the entire idea as madness. They met only yesterday, she argues. He counters that he has made far greater decisions in far less time. He claims to be a master at reading the human heart, and that he has already deciphered hers. He calls her captivating, brilliant, defiant, and authentic, a combination so exceedingly rare that in his world it must be pursued. She asks what this pursuit would entail, making it clear she will not be some rich man's diversion. Good, he answers. He has no interest in anything fleeting. He explains that when he commits, it is absolute. If they were to do this, she would not be a mere distraction. She would be a conscious choice, an investment. The word investment strikes her like a physical blow, and she repeats it numbly, remarking that it sounds like a business arrangement. He argues that all of life is a series of transactions. The only things that truly matter are that the terms are fair and both parties are honest. His hand tightens over hers as he details the offer. It is not charity, but access. He can open doors to clients with immense wealth, offer her complete safety and security, and provide her a life where the fear of survival never again crosses her mind. She asks what he would demand in return. His answer is dangerously simple. Her. He wants her time, her focus, her unvarnished honesty. He needs someone unafraid to call him an arrogant monster to his face, someone who will argue with him over the small things that ignite her spirit. He wants the 100% unfiltered Adriana without a single compromise. She knows she should rise from her chair and walk away this instant. Any sane person would see the glaring signs of danger. A powerful man, accustomed to purchasing his desires, is making a proposition that seems too perfect to be true and is undoubtedly laden with hidden costs. And yet she finds herself completely mesmerized. No one has ever looked at her as Carlo is looking at her now, as if she were a priceless treasure, a prize to be won, as if her rebellious soul were her greatest virtue, not a flaw. She finally tells him that she needs time to consider his proposal. He agrees, calling it a fair request, and assuring her he has nowhere else to be. He releases her hand and signals for the check. Then he suggests that while she deliberates, he will show her something of his world. Not the dark and violent corners, but the parts that might appeal to a woman like her. He smiles and tells her it is time for them to leave. The night is still young, he remarks, mentioning how Naples is at its most beautiful this time of year. Leaving the restaurant, they venture into the narrow arteries of the old city. Carlo acts as her guide, indicating buildings he owns, sharing local history, and receiving nods from shopkeepers that convey both fear and deference. This charming benefactor role is a stark contrast to the brutal legends surrounding the mob boss. The man was a king, perfectly in tune with the city's heartbeat, aware of all its secret rhythms and hidden paths. Their walk concludes at Castel dell'Ovo, a fortress overlooking the sea. The gates are sealed shut, but a single word from Carlo grants them passage to the ramparts. The view was an absolute masterpiece. Naples glittered beneath them, a galaxy of light scattered across the land. Mount Vesuvius was a colossal shadow looming in the darkness. "This is my place of restoration," Carlo admits, his hand resting on the cool stone. "When deals become complicated or my family creates drama. From up here, you realize how insignificant it all is. The mountains we battle over in the streets are just pebbles from this vantage point." She can only whisper, "It's magnificent." "It is," he agrees, "but that is not why we are here." The atmosphere shifts. He turns to her, his expression suddenly grave. "I brought you here so you could see me without my armor, not the magnate, just Carlo. A man weary of being alone. A man who saw something in you and chose to risk being turned away, who is standing here now, asking for another chance." That perfectly executed display of vulnerability obliterates her defenses. This was an entirely different man from the Don who had commanded her to dinner. This was a man on his knees, metaphorically offering up a fragile hope, laying his entire psyche bare. She whispers back, "One more night. Let me meet the man, not the legend. If it is real, we will see. If not, we are just two strangers who had incredible pizza." Carlo's smile was like the breaking of dawn. "A single night," he murmurs, "is foundation enough for an empire." He moves closer, and she feels the inevitable kiss before it arrives. Every instinct screams warnings to retreat, rebuild her fortress, and maintain her distance. Instead, her body betrays her, leaning into the danger. The kiss itself was no conquest. It was soft, almost tentative, as if he feared one wrong move would cause her to vanish. His thumb brushes her cheek, a ghost of a touch that unleashes a tremor deep within Adriana. The walls she had spent years building, brick by painful brick, begin to fracture. Pulling apart for air, Carlo whispers that she will be his undoing. He calls her an infiltrator, capable of reawakening parts of himself he had long ago locked away. She meets his drama with a defiant spark of her own, breathing out a single word: "Good." She wants him to feel the chaotic storm of humanity, not just the cold calculus of control. A low private laugh escapes him as he admits this is precisely how she keeps him unbalanced. When she confesses she is just as lost, he mirrors her, trapping them both in a shared, deliberate confusion. And so she proposes a truce, that they attempt to navigate this chaos together. He withdraws slightly, his gaze a quiet, burning fire. Then he seizes control once more, declaring he is taking her home and that their next meeting is already set, instructing her to wear practical shoes. She notes his strategy, and he confirms that once his path is chosen, his focus is absolute. He framed his dominance not as a command, but as a promise, a game of words she found more seductive than menacing. As they moved through the sleeping city, his hand repeatedly found hers. A deep silence fell between them, an unsettling intimacy for two people who had known each other for less than 48 hours. Arriving at her building, he circles the car to open her door and escorts her to the entrance. She thanks him for the dinner, the castle, and what she terms his surprisingly non-threatening presence. A faint smile plays on Carlo's lips as he admits he could be a monster if required, but that she held a protected status. "Not with you," he vowed, his fingers expertly brushing a strand of hair from her face. He announces their next engagement for 10 in the morning. When she asks where, he calls it a surprise and poses a test. "Do you trust me?" He seemed to relish her immediate no. His kiss on her forehead was a strangely graceful act, a gentle pressure that unlocked something deep inside as he simply ordered her to be there anyway. She watched him dissolve into the street below before climbing the 4 flights to her apartment, her mind a swirling vortex of chaos. She had just agreed to see Carlo Ferretti again, had yielded to his touch, and was now entertaining thoughts of a future with a man from the shadows who had been watching her every move. Where panic should have been, a dangerous exhilaration hummed instead. A moment later, a text vibrated from an untraceable phone. The message was an order. "Do not block this one. I need a line of contact." When she asked how many such devices he possessed, the reply from CF Carlo Ferretta was a single, ice-cold word. Enough. His following text was a probe for his own ego. Was the night good for her? She answered that his company was the source of her enjoyment. He grew serious, saying excitement can sour into regret and that he needed to know her feelings were real. She insisted she felt no remorse, but that a final verdict awaited whatever he had planned next. His last message described his plan not as a secret, but as perfect, and concluded with one word: Bella. Beautiful. It sent an impossible warmth through her. She fell asleep with the device in her hand, her dreams filled with his face. By 9:30 the next morning, she was dressed in casual attire, complying perfectly with his instructions. She understood that anything Carlo orchestrated would be a complete production. He appeared at precisely 10 o'clock, the epitome of casual wealth. In his hands were 2 coffees and pastries, the clear gesture of a provider, a man who delivers what he promises. "We have a long drive," he announced, handing her the breakfast. They left Naples behind, ascending into the hills as the coast unfurled below them like a cinematic backdrop. Carlo drove with an expert's grace, providing a quiet commentary on the region's history as they climbed ever higher. He began weaving a story of his childhood, of family trips along the same coast, constructing a false shared past to present himself as a sensitive soul. He called them simpler times, before the world became a tangled web. When she asked when that was, he replied, it was the year he learned what his father's ships were truly transporting. He painted the scene of his defining choice: a safe, circumscribed life, or a dangerous gamble to expand the family empire. His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "I chose to build something larger," he affirmed, adding that his father never forgave the decision. When she asked if he ever felt regret, he confessed that sometimes he did. The doubts, he confessed, only surfaced at 3 in the morning, when sleep felt like a distant land. But daylight always reinforced his mission, for power, for control, for a legacy. He then took her hand, admitting that sharing this weight with someone who understood was a new and perilous part of his strategy. A private road carried them to a villa carved into the hillside, its elegance understated and profound. It was a structure of ancient stone, nestled within old olive groves and quiet gardens. As he silenced the engine, she asked who owned it. He turned to her, his voice low. "It's mine." He had purchased it 3 years ago, he said, restoring it as his refuge from the city, a place to return to his roots. He exited the car, opened her door, and delivered the masterstroke. "I have never brought another person here. You are the first." It was a confession perfectly engineered to make her feel chosen. The villa's interior was an exercise in quiet luxury, bathed in sunlight and adorned with authentic art. A professional kitchen and a living room with a stone hearth flowed onto a terrace with a view so immense it seemed to steal the air from her lungs. "Carlo, this is," she began, the words failing her. He led her past the terrace into a vast, empty room, drenched in sun from windows on 3 sides. He explained that after studying her art, he saw this space as her studio, a haven for her work, where she would be beholden to no one, her own kingdom. She found the notion that he would simply give her such a thing to be insane. "I want to offer it," he corrected, his words precise. He presented it as a gift with no conditions, a space to cultivate her business if she chose to cultivate a life with him. She recoiled, saying it was far too much, that they were essentially strangers. He calmly dismantled her protest, arguing that they understood each other's essential nature more deeply than most couples who had been together for years. A grand lie designed to warp the fabric of time. He then listed his own flaws: arrogance, compulsion, before reflecting hers. Stubborn, brilliant, but without means. He presented these as simple facts, leaving one question hanging. Is the undeniable current between them real? He then cupped her face, an act of both power and unnerving tenderness. He claims it is not a lifelong contract, just a workspace to grant her freedom. But she recognized it for what it was: security and liberty. She breathed a single word: everything. He cut her off, insisting she had earned it, stroking her pride while tightening his hold. He pleaded, "Allow me to give you this, Adriana." A grand performance of generosity. For him, the gesture was nothing. For her, it was everything. She could feel the unspoken terms, the trap he was setting, but she knew he was right. She desperately needed it. She pushed back, saying she required time to think. He agreed with a suspicious ease, whispering that he and the villa were not going anywhere. A quiet vow of possession. He then pressed a key into her hand, a physical chain to bind her to him. They remained at the villa, where Carlo prepared a simple lunch. The meal served as a stage for him to speak of his family's enterprise, casting himself as a man bearing the weight of the world. The entire cozy scene was a masterful illusion. In turn, she confided in him, speaking of a past with broken men who sought to either fix or rescue her. The admission left her utterly vulnerable, but in the silence, she felt seen for the first time. Carlo simply refilled her wine and said, "I have no desire to fix you." He immediately dismantled her self-image of being broken, redefining it as a temporary lack of funds, a powerful psychological maneuver. A small laugh escaped her. In her world, men were either saviors or quitters. He then delivered the classic flex, saying the studio was nothing to him, an assertion of his immense wealth. The villa stands empty 11 months of the year. This gift costs him nothing, yet offers her everything. He tests her, asking if she suspects a condition. She agrees that distrust is her default. He counters, positioning himself as the one exception to all her rules. He makes contact, a touch designed to create instant intimacy and compel her trust. He laid out his plan with calculated honesty. He wants her companionship, sees a future, and will fund her work. But the studio, he said, with a pointed squeeze of her hand, was entirely separate. He swore the offer was untethered to her body or her loyalty. It existed purely for her art. This verbal contract stipulated that if she lost interest in him, the studio would remain hers, free and clear. She searched his face for any hint of a lie, for the cold look of a predator. Instead, she found a disturbing sincerity that was far more frightening than an obvious deception. "Why?" she asked softly, mentally inventorying her own lack of wealth or connections. He told her that everyone else in his life has an agenda, a desire to use his influence. Her ignorance of his identity was the very thing that ensnared him. It was the lure. She challenged him without fear, seeing a man, not a monster. A purity so raw, he confessed, it was like a poison he couldn't resist. She saw his interest as a clinical study. "Never," he countered, his voice sharp. "You are the only solid soul in a world of phantoms." And then he reveals another layer, leading her to a transformed barn. The space was a sanctuary of creation, a vast workshop with soaring windows and a stone hearth, an artisan's heaven. A silent woodshop lay within, its tools and unfinished pieces resting in perfect order. A fine film of sawdust coated everything, the residue of his escape from a world of stratagems. She moved through a silent gallery of his making, her fingers tracing a tabletop, a chair, and a perfect bookshelf, each piece a testament to the man beneath the terrifying legend. He admitted his hands had shaped every object. It was the single lesson from his father that endured. To create is superior to consumption. In this space, the formidable Carlo Ferretti dissolved, leaving only Carlo, a man bound by his father's simple law: measure twice, cut once. He understood that true mastery cannot be hurried. By unveiling this intimate, creative haven, he was offering her a fragment of his very soul. This was not the magnate. This was the maker, compelled by a primal urge to build that she knew in her own bones. She saw in him a mirror of her own spirit, one who knew creation nourished the soul in ways currency never could. She voiced her gratitude for this glimpse behind his armor. He seized the opening, claiming she had to see his true drive if they were to build something real. He insisted they were cut from the same cloth, forged by their own will and determination. The sole distinction he proposed was his comfort in the moral twilight. A subtle smile touched her lips as the seduction of his reasoning took hold. He questioned if his gambit was succeeding. Perhaps. She narrowed the distance, confessing her captivation with this unseen facet of him, the craftsman, the guardian of this hallowed ground. His voice a low whisper, he corrected her gently. No other woman had ever crossed its threshold. Then his hands found her waist, drawing her close. He voiced his hope she would return often, a soft invitation devoid of overt force. She observed the speed of his advance. At 33, he had no patience for games. When he discovered something of value, he argued, procrastination was a fool's errand. Life is too fleeting, he reasoned, to waste on anything that doesn't feel true. She, he confessed, restored his humanity, elevated him. He closed the space for a kiss, an unspoken command to silence her doubt. This one was more profound, desperate, born of their absolute seclusion. His fingers wove into her hair as her hands clenched his shoulders. The world outside them ceased to be. Parting, he pressed his forehead to hers, asking her to remain for dinner for the night. An invitation, he clarified, not a command, unless she wished it so. She offered to assist with the meal, a pretext to linger. A battle ignited in her mind. Reason screamed of peril, but her heart, already enthralled by the intoxicating risk, silenced the alarms. She heard her own voice consent. The moment she yielded, a measured relief flickered in his eyes. a calculated display meant to breach her final defenses. He invented a task that would consume hours, confessing it was a ruse to prolong her stay. She felt the gilded bars of a cage descend and welcomed them. As Carlo prepared their meal, she drifted back to the studio, sketchbook in hand. A creative ember, long dormant, began to glow. The flawless light, the profound silence. It was the crucible she needed to burn away her financial anxieties and simply make something new. 30 minutes later, Carlo appeared at the door to announce dinner. She glanced up, startled to find 2 hours had dissolved in a haze of creation. The studio was perfect, she breathed. It was hers, he declared, as if settling a matter long decided. He drew near to inspect her work, murmuring that the sketches were beautiful. He inquired if they were for the hotel. Some were, but others were born of a new, private impulse she'd lacked the peace to explore. From this moment on, he vowed, she would want for neither time nor tranquility. Dinner was a carefully set stage on the terrace, illuminated by candlelight against a sunset bleeding over the water. He returned to his earlier challenge, demanding a secret she had never spoken aloud. After a moment's hesitation, she revealed her most profound fear, that this was all an illusion, and she would awaken to the familiar poverty of her past. Carlo assured her he was real, the villa was real, while conceding her world had been inverted with dizzying speed. The sheer surreality of it all consumed her. 2 days prior, they had argued over a parking space. Now, in his home, she contemplated an offer that would rewrite her existence. He noted that life accelerates wildly once you abandon the pretense of control. He refilled her wine, then offered a confession of his own. He hadn't known such peace in years, his mind perpetually wired for conflict. In her presence, he could simply be, a state both terrifying and sublime. For him, ceding control was a novel and potent sensation. They retreated indoors beside the fire, the conversation spiraling deeper into the night. They exchanged histories, of dreams and fears, of failures and triumphs. He spoke of betrayals in his world, of witnessing violence, of the crushing weight of an empire resting on his shoulders. She had to ask if he ever dreamed of abandoning the family enterprise for a clean slate. The thought, he confessed, was a constant shadow, but escape was not a choice. Too many lives depended on him. His brothers were enforcers, not architects. Carlo cast his criminal syndicate as a noble obligation to his dependents. His gaze then settled on Adriana, and he saw her as he saw his villa, a beautiful, governable sanctuary for his mind. With a soft, deliberate touch, he began his campaign of acquisition. To him, she was the elegant solution to a chaotic existence, a flawless reflection of his own desires. Her internal conflict was plain, yet he reframed her anxiety as a sign she was nearing truth, urging her to seize power by silencing her own intuition. He led her to a guest room, another exquisitely furnished, solitary space. Carlo feigned pause at the door, a pantomime of respect for a boundary he intended to obliterate. It was a silent test of her compliance. Her gratitude was the signal he awaited. He advanced, initiating physical contact. He stated plainly he would not permit her to flee, a verbal branding of his claim. This ceaseless pressure is a time-worn strategy to erode a person's defenses. His murmured promise of everything was the first chapter in a campaign of love bombing. Her profound disorientation was his intended effect, catapulting her from a life of scarcity to the orbit of a titan. Her own mind screamed the warnings, yet the pull was irresistible. The initial filaments of a trauma bond were taking root. His subsequent text was a gentle prod, a digital reconnaissance mission into her psyche. And here we witness her cross the threshold of safety. She abandoned her assigned sanctuary for his chamber, an unequivocal signal that her instincts for self-preservation had been disabled. He received her half-clothed, an effortless exhibition of dominance. Her question, was this foolishness or courage, hung in the air, revealing her fractured inner state. It could be both, he replied, normalizing her psychological schism. He drew her into his bed, the culminating act of his conquest. Her doubt about their viability perfectly articulated the chasm between their worlds, giving voice to a perfectly rational fear. Her sense of self had been woven from the threads of her social world. He began to sever those threads methodically, lauding her essence over her standing, positioning himself as the sole arbiter of her value. He employed a classic tactic of isolation, denigrating his own circle as hollow and false. The objective was to frame himself as her singular guardian, the only one who truly understood, thereby ensuring her total reliance on him. He constructed a perfect mirror of her, enumerating her virtues to forge an echo chamber of validation. This discussion of a shared future, mere days in, was a calculated maneuver to accelerate intimacy and bypass logical consideration. He reframed her capitulation as a mutual choice, as if they were leaping into a romantic vortex as equals. This narrative absolved him, casting them as partners in a fated melodrama, rather than as hunter and hunted. She conceded her self-preservation was gone, a vulnerability he instantly exploited, reinforcing her for lowering her defenses. The offer to just sleep was a deliberate stratagem to gently erode her personal borders. His use of the word please was a weapon, a portrayal of vulnerability designed to shatter her final emotional bulwark. Her silence was acquiescence, and the steady rhythm of his heart became the physical anchor for her nascent dependency. He preempted her fears about his reputation, neutralizing them with a carefully deployed tale of sorrow. Her words, "I am choosing to believe you," were a conscious act of ignoring every warning sign to inhabit this new constructed reality. The sensations of safety and of being chosen in his embrace are classic indicators of a trauma bond. Awakening in an empty bed was a deliberate gambit to destabilize her, forging a vacuum that only he could occupy, thus solidifying his role as her anchor. A note on the pillow served as an edict for her mourning, an extension of his control in his absence. The lavish spread of food was a stark exhibition of his power and his position as her solitary provider. He explicitly connected the act of providing food to his family's expression of love, an open admission that he was conditioning her for affection and reliance, handling her less like a partner and more like a cherished project. He orchestrated her re-entry into a life she once knew, a demonstration that his influence extended far beyond his mansion's confines. The gallery exhibition was framed as her great opportunity, but in truth, it was the formal debut of his newest possession. She recoils at the idea of being a trophy. But with a predator's grace, he evades the charge. He reframes her with a single, devastating word: his choice. This verbal alchemy stills her rebellion and tightens his grip, a silent acknowledgement that she is now the polished reflection of his power. This fusion of their lives, the personal bleeding into the professional, is sold to her as a shrewd step up the ladder. It is a cold, practical argument, a carefully crafted appeal to her ambition, designed to silence the screaming of her intuition. During the entire drive home, his touch was a near constant presence on her, an incessant physical reminder of their bond. She interpreted the look on his face as the quiet contentment of a predator savoring a successful hunt. His insistence on walking her to her door was an act of marking territory masked as chivalry. The kiss that came after was not about affection, but about assertion, designed to leave an indelible physical and psychological brand of his ownership on her. He offered her a key, a profound emblem of his command. This symbol of access was also a tether. She attempted to decline, but he icily dismissed her, wielding his wealth as a power she could not counter. He depicted her self-reliance as a character flaw in need of his correction. His financial support was not a gift, but a tool for her advancement, rendering any refusal on her part as illogical and self-defeating. Alone in her own apartment, her mind was in turmoil. A sudden eruption of creativity followed, perhaps a subconscious drive to prove his declared faith in her talent was in fact justified. The few garments hanging in her closet were a stark illustration of the profound power disparity between them. She chose her one respectable dress, once an asset for her career, now reduced to a costume for the new character he had cast her as. The result was respectable, though hardly a masterpiece. Carlo arrived precisely at 7 p.m. The way he looked at her vanquished all her prior anxieties. His verdict was swift and absolute. "You look beautiful. Perfect." The gallery was a converted warehouse in a wealthy enclave, its vast interior displaying high-value contemporary art. Carlo guided her through the assembly, his hand planted possessively on her lower back, introducing her to the Naples Art World establishment. He was specific. "This is Adriana Romano, a brilliant designer. You must see her work." He never employed romantic terms. A professional framing she valued more than he realized. As they considered a massive abstract work, a woman's voice cut sharply through the hum of conversation. "Carlo Ferretti, I was told you brought a companion. I had to witness it myself." They turned toward a blonde woman in her early 30s whose polished appearance signaled inherited wealth. Her gaze was sharp with disdain as Carlo's voice became utterly devoid of warmth. "Bianca, I was not aware you would be here." Paolo sent an invitation. He thought I might enjoy the art. Her eyes performed a swift, cold appraisal of me. "So, you are the celebrated one. The woman who challenged him for a parking space? How droll." Carlo said, "Adriana, this is Bianca Conti, a former acquaintance." "His ex," Bianca clarified. We were an item for almost a year until Carlo concluded he preferred his own company. The tension in the air was palpable. I attempted to step back, but Carlo's grip only tightened. He stated tonelessly, "Bianca and I were involved briefly 3 years ago. It was an incompatible pairing. We had different life goals." "You mean I wanted a future and you wanted a loophole?" Bianca countered, her smile like a razor. "But it appears you've reconsidered. Carlo Ferretti attending an event with someone? That is newsworthy. She must be quite something." "She is," Carlo retorted. "Now, if you'll pardon us." "One moment, I'm intrigued." Bianca moved closer, examining me as if I were a curiosity under glass. "What is your profession, Adriana? Let me speculate. Model? Actress?" Carlo's usual preference. With a steady voice, she responded, "I am a designer with a focus on graphics and brand identity." "How quaint. And your training?" "The Academy of Fine Arts in Naples." "Charming. And your family, are they artists as well?" This was not a conversation. It was a thorough social vetting to ascertain her standing. Carlo's expression grew cold. He knew precisely what game she was playing. "Bianca, these questions are tedious. Adriana has no need to justify herself to you." Bianca's voice took on a sickly sweet quality. "I'm simply making small talk, becoming acquainted with the woman who finally seized Carlo Ferretti's interest. That is quite the accomplishment, my dear. The rest of us felt fortunate to get a few months." "Perhaps that is more telling of you than it is of Carlo," I retorted, the words surprising even myself. "If you failed to hold his attention, maybe you were not as remarkable as you assumed." Bianca's stare hardened. "Tread carefully, little one. You have no inkling of who you are speaking to." Carlo's voice sliced in, low and like ice. "Neither do you," he said. "Adriana is my guest. A conflict with her is a conflict with me. I suggest you walk away now, Bianca, before this affair sours." The threat was unmistakable. Rage flashed in Bianca's eyes before she composed her features into a false smile. "Of course. No offense was intended. Enjoy the exhibition." She departed, leaving an intensely uncomfortable silence in her wake. The moment she was gone, Carlo murmured, "I apologize for that. Bianca handles rejection poorly. I should have foreseen that she might be here." "It's all right," I said, attempting to compose myself. "I can handle a volatile ex." Then, pointedly, "But it makes me question how many more of your past relationships I might encounter at these functions." "Not many," he answered. "I have avoided serious attachments for years. Bianca was the closest I have ever come, and that was more a matter of convenience than genuine emotion." He guided me to a less crowded area of the gallery. "But I must be entirely honest with you," he went on. "My past is fraught. There have been other women, a great many, but they were of no consequence. None of them were ever you." "That sounds like a line you have perfected." "It is not," he countered, his voice utterly serious. "I had arrangements, transactions with no emotional component. I had fleeting encounters with women who desired my name, and I have had only one relationship that was even remotely real. That concluded 3 years ago when it became clear we were both just performing our parts." He took my hands. "But this connection with you is different. It is real, it is powerful, and it is likely unfolding far too rapidly, but it is sincere. You must believe me," I whispered. "I believe you." "But surely you can see how surreal this all is. Your world, these people, the conflict, the judgment. It is an immense amount to process." "I am aware," he said. "And if it becomes too much, you must tell me. We will find another path." He drew me closer. "But do not let individuals like Bianca cause you to doubt yourself. You have a place here. You are talented and brilliant, and you earned your position." I paused. "Even if I do not have a wealthy family?" I asked. "Even if I have absolutely no connections?" "That is the very reason why. You are here because of your own skill and effort, not because of a surname. That carries more significance." He kissed my temple. "Now come. I want you to meet Paolo. He is the collector I mentioned, the one who may be interested in your work." The remainder of the evening was a dizzying sequence of introductions. Paolo Santoro was an agreeable man in his 50s, consumed by art and possessed of the capital to support his obsession. He browsed my portfolio, which Carlo displayed on his tablet, and was genuinely impressed. Paolo nodded repeatedly, remarking, "This work is of a higher caliber. It is sophisticated, yet retains an accessible quality. It's exactly what we require for a hotel rebrand I'm managing. Can you come to my office next week? I want to discuss commissioning you." I had to suppress a cry of elation. "Of course, I would be thrilled." Paolo smiled. Carlo Ferretti's public endorsement was a masterful display of influence. By elevating Adriana, he wasn't just being kind, he was essentially crowning her. Securing acclaim from a powerful man was part of his strategy, a method to bind her to him with professional gratitude, leaving her caught in a state of indebtedness. The change from the gallery's public stage to the car's private domain was a calculated pivot. Her thankfulness was the precise opening he required to reverse the power balance. He then issued a summons disguised as an invitation to his residence. He was not offering safety, but signaling that a harsh truth was imminent. And it is here that the nature of their arrangement becomes perfectly lucid. He is revealing his world not as some riddle she must solve, but as a kingdom she must consciously choose to enter. His house in Chia, a place where high culture and brute force coexisted, served as a perfect metaphor for the man himself. The room was an elaborate stage, arranged to appear authentic and lived in, and intended to make her lower her defenses. The ritual of pouring wine preceded the life-altering disclosure, his command for her to sit established clearly who directed this scene. This was not a conversation. It was a carefully choreographed revelation of the true monster. He assembled his confession with a surgeon's care, commencing with the legitimate shipping company, the very basis of his public identity. This was the moral facade he maintained before pulling her into the shadows of his actual power, a realm that provided a stable livelihood for over 200 people. This respectable front, he explained, was merely the launching point for his other enterprises. These were operations that functioned in the gray area where laws are malleable, where secrecy is paramount and ordinary regulations are irrelevant. He described a shadow economy fueled by logistics and so-called protection services. He then established his false moral parameters, denying any trade in narcotics or human beings, a tidy list of abstentions designed to make his criminal organization seem almost principled. The legitimate company was a cage, he asserted, too slow and restrictive for his vast ambitions. Then he cast himself as a dark protector, a shadow authority who looked after society's forgotten, the formerly incarcerated, the undocumented, the struggling families. His casual claim of objectivity was simply a refined way to market his function as a necessary darkness. The confession reached its most chilling moment when he spoke of violence. He didn't paint it as a moral failure, but as an instrument of business. Vengeance was reframed as maintaining order, an act of necessary cruelty he felt neither pride nor shame for. His creed was simple: appearance is reality. In his world, any show of vulnerability was a death sentence, making cruelty a required performance. This stark candor was his sharpest weapon, ensnaring her not with falsehoods, but the horrifying allure of a raw truth. This entire, unfiltered honesty approach was a chillingly brilliant psychological maneuver. By framing his dark confession as her right to know, he transformed his violent life into a test of her allegiance, essentially asking her to knowingly accept his darkness as part of the bargain. He punctuated this devastating monologue with a deliberate, intimate gesture, giving his words a physical weight. The decision was now entirely hers. He had presented the unvarnished reality of his violent existence, and her response would now define her own moral character. Any rational soul would have fled. But her own rationality had been meticulously corroded by his strategic tenderness. The private dinners, the professional encouragement, the tragic histories. These were the tolls he paid to purchase her submission and paralyze her instinct to flee. Her acceptance was a complete capitulation to his reality. When she began to wonder about her own sanity, he skillfully reframed her self-doubt as a combination of courage and folly. In his narrative, her staying wasn't weakness, but a profound, if utterly reckless, commitment. He told her that her devotion was a potent drug, admitting he had been certain she would walk away. In response, she attempted to set the terms of her own surrender, establishing rules that were a mere illusion of agency in a world where he controlled everything. Her conditions were a flimsy dam against his world, a pledge of honesty, a clear separation from his criminal affairs, and a guaranteed exit for her safety. She would have no part in his illicit operations, nor would she become their collateral. A subtle nerve pulsing in his jaw was the only sign his consent was tactical, not sincere. He vowed to vanish from her life if he ever endangered it. With her final consent, a smile of pure, conquering victory sealed their pact. Their agreement was finalized with a possessive kiss, a physical claiming that echoed the verbal one. His vow to ensure she'd never have regrets was his ultimate assertion of power. Her reply, aware of the danger, yet still diving in, signified her acceptance of this new, tragic trajectory. Carlo instantly dictated the new terms of their life. Her presence at his villa was mandatory, her status as his was to be public, and his network was hers to advance her career. These were not offers. They were decrees meant to absorb her life into his. He presented total ownership as the antithesis of indifference, insisting his aim was not control, even as he orchestrated a complete merger of their lives. She interpreted his demand for absolute power as a mark of deep emotional commitment, a twisted remedy for a past filled with men who never cared. Their physical encounters were a microcosm of their entire dynamic. It was an outright conquest, transcending romance and mirroring his fundamental nature. A passionate predator who drove her beyond every boundary she had ever known. Afterward, her mind would blare with warnings, but he would simply quell the noise. Sensing her panic, he dismissed it as overthinking. His soft instruction to sleep was a subtle method to stifle her apprehension and maintain his hold. In the following weeks, their arrangement yielded significant dividends. The studio at the villa reignited her creative spark. She secured a pitch for a hotel, marking her first major contract in over a year. The work from Paolo Santoro led to 2 more contracts, solidifying her professional resurgence. She and Carlo settled into a pattern, merging their disparate worlds through cooking, working, and sharing the small details of their days. But entry into his circle came with an unspoken trial. His brothers, Luca and Marco, were a harsher reflection of him, their courtesy a thin veneer. They were the sentinels, assessing her until she could prove her permanence. The true gatekeeper was his mother, Maria Ferretti. Her quiet disapproval was a direct affront to Adriana's social standing. Our girl was an anomaly in their dynasty, a truth underscored by a chillingly insincere politeness. Carlo, at 33, justified his decision by calling himself modern and his mother traditional. But the conflict revealed a fissure in his authority, a clash between obligation and want. Adriana realized she was a player in a contest without knowing the rules. This delicate equilibrium shattered roughly 6 weeks after they had met. He returned home with a grim expression, dragging his dark world into their sanctuary. He delivered the fateful words, "We have to talk," signaling another seismic change. The issue, it transpired, was a matter of underworld politics. His peers were urging him to formalize their bond, not out of sentiment, but for the appearance of stability. He stressed it was not a marriage proposal, but a strategic imperative. An uncommitted partner projected volatility and raised doubts about her longevity. This had nothing to do with emotion, it was a corporate decision. He wasn't proposing marriage, he was asking her to wear the emblem of his brand. He presents the entire affair not as a betrothal, but as a promise ring, a public declaration of his claim on her. He then produces a velvet box, feigning that she has the absolute freedom to reject the proposition. He silences her objections before they can even form, offering her a false veneer of choice. Within the box lay a huge diamond on a white gold band, an undeniable statement of power. All she could manage was a whispered, "It is stunning." He had her trapped. This ring, he explained, would quell the whispers. He held her gaze, effectively communicating his desire for the world to recognize her as his property, provided she genuinely wanted it. The timeline was staggering, 6 weeks from a parking dispute to this moment. In an instant, he had become the axis of her world. The velocity of it all was intoxicating, a feverish obsession that resonated with her own hidden desires. With a firm voice, she capitulated. Yes, I will wear your ring. I will be yours. Carlo's immediate smile confirmed her surrender had been the correct move. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a flawless fit he had clearly prearranged. Drawing her close, he whispered, "You will never regret this." In a tone that felt more like a warning, she challenged him, telling him to prove it. His response was a vow of eternal loyalty, his gaze burning with a fierce intensity. He acknowledged the pace was wild, but justified it as a consequence of his certainty that she was his fate. "You are deranged," she breathed, her hands already tangled in his hair, the new ring glinting. "Completely deranged," he conceded, framing it as a shared condition. He motioned to the ring, evidence that she was equally mad. She had no defense. He cemented their pact. "We'll be mad together." Later, as the ring caught the moonlight, she replayed the entire narrative in her mind, from a trivial parking clash to the consort of a Neapolitan titan. It was a waking dream. She was actively justifying these perilous choices, reframing them as strokes of incredible luck. And Carlo, the architect of this entire game, continued to laud her for the very defiant spirit that had made her his target from the beginning. He employed touch and flattery, claiming their 5-minute argument had altered the course of his life. When she attempted to minimize it, he simply dismissed her. He was mythologizing a mundane conflict into their foundational legend. The physical intensity escalated, an action he explicitly linked to her defiance. It was then she confessed, "I love you," a classic symptom of a trauma bond. He stilled, visibly relishing his absolute triumph. He then physically dominated her, tilting her head back and demanding she repeat the words. He echoed her sentiment, but explicitly tied his love to her initial act of rebellion. The logic was completely warped. Her 6-week timeline underscored the madness of it all. From a petty squabble to this new reality, she interpreted his manipulation as a sign of his unwavering devotion. Their absurd fight over a parking space had become their twisted destiny.